Good morning, everyone. How are we doing today? Are we good? It is so great to be with you. If you are watching online, thank you so much for tuning in. We're excited to spend this time together. So today we are continuing in our series, Parables, the stories that Jesus told. And what we've been doing each week in this series is just taking a look at one of these short stories that we find Jesus telling in the Gospels. We talked about how parables are often a combination of metaphors or similes, and they use common imagery and common things that people would have understood in Jesus' culture and context. But oftentimes with the parables is they have unexpected outcomes and endings that challenge the way that we understand God and ourselves. And each week we've just been taking a look at one of these stories and just sitting with it and listening to what Jesus is saying. Well, today we're going to look at a story that's found in Luke chapter 14, and it's called the Parable of the Great Banquet. And Jesus happens to tell this story while he is at a banquet. While he's at a dinner party, he tells the story. But before we jump into it, we're going to back up a little bit and talk about something that will help us understand the fullness of what Jesus is saying, and that is the eating habits of Jesus. Now, that might sound like kind of a strange thing. But when we look into the Gospels, which are the 4 books that talk about the life of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we have these little details that are given about how Jesus spent his time and what he did. And there's little insights that we get. Jesus spent time traveling. He spent time teaching and healing people. He spent a lot of time with his original 12 disciples and just being with them. But we're also told that Jesus spent a lot of time eating. In fact, over and over again, there's these scenes where Jesus is going over to someone's house for a meal. Sometimes he gets invited. Sometimes he invites himself over, which is like my favorite thing. And he just constantly is having like these meals with people and sharing with them and celebrating life. And he does this so much that there's all sorts of kind of different accusations that are leveled against him. But Jesus understood the importance of celebrating what that was like. He loved a good get-together. Now, show of hands, how many of you in here, you love a good get-together? You love a party? Be honest, come on, all right, there we go. We got some people showing hands. Maybe you like to host, you love preparing the food and cooking, and when it's like Christmas time, around the holidays, you can't wait for people to come over, or maybe you just like free food, and so when that's happening, you're there. So Jesus, I think he understood that. Like, some of the best times in life happen when we are gathered with family and friends and we can share in food and maybe conversation and laughter and when there's music. I mean, those are some of the best times in life. So Jesus does this frequently all the time. He's going over and sharing in meals. And some of the accusations that come are critiques of people that are seeing Jesus do this. And one of the things that he gets called a glutton and a drunkard because they see this rabbi, this teacher, and he's having meals with people. He's sharing his table with people, and so they begin to criticize. But really the criticism that comes towards Jesus is about the people that he invites to his table, the people that he includes, the people that he chooses to eat with. The gospel writer Mark, he gives us this insight. He says, while Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed Jesus. When the teachers of the law who were Pharisees saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, why? Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Now, our first reaction to this might be, well, why do they ask this question? What's the big deal? Why do they care who Jesus eats with? And the reason why is because in the ancient world, in the culture that Jesus lived in, there were all sorts of rules and regulations about meals. There were rules about what you could eat and what you couldn't eat, how that food was prepared, what made it clean or what made it unclean. But there were also rules about the people that you'd invite to your table. And Jesus, as a rabbi, as a Jewish male, there were all sorts of things that you wouldn't do in that culture. But Jesus had what we might call a table ministry, where he invited all sorts of people to come and share and be a part of his table. He included them and he invited them. A guy named Walter Brueggemann, who's a writer, he's a professor, he wrote a book called The Prophetic Imagination, where he talked about the role of prophets in the ancient history of Israel and how the prophets oftentimes were really revolutionary and countercultural in what they were calling people to do. He likens that Jesus carries the same spirit in his life, that he in some ways is acting as his prophet, as he's calling, as he's teaching. And he says that when Jesus would have these meals with people, what Jesus was doing wasn't just something out of the norm. It wasn't just like, oh, there goes Jesus again. He just does things a little differently. He actually was sending a message. And what Jesus was doing was a dismantling of the power structures in his culture. By choosing to eat with people that normally weren't welcomed, Jesus was sharing a message that was so much bigger than anyone could understand or even anticipate. That God's mercy was just as much for those who were deemed to be in the wrong as for those who thought they were in the right. That's the heart of what Jesus does, is he pushes back on these categories that define people's value and their worth. So Jesus had an open table, and he ate with all kinds of people. But in the story we're going to look at today, Jesus is not eating at the house of someone who would have been thought of as being a sinner or unrighteous. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Jesus is over at the house of someone who had power and influence, somebody who would have been looked at as a leader, somebody who would have been looked at as having it all together, who was holy. And it's at this dinner party that Jesus chooses to tell a story that's pretty shocking and pretty powerful. Now, Luke 14 is kind of a longer chapter. If you're going to follow along in your Bible today, we're going to skim through a couple parts that get to the main story that Jesus shares. But it begins with this little piece of context that Luke gives us in verse 1. We read this: one Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. So right here, just in the beginning, this one verse, Luke gives us just a little context as to what is happening in this dinner party. And the first thing that we notice is that it's on the Sabbath. Now, this is important because already in Jesus' ministry, he's been criticized for how he understands the Sabbath and how he practices it. Now, the Sabbath is this incredible thing that God gave his people in the Old Testament, and there's so much that we could say about it. You can trace the origins of how the Sabbath developed, but it was a gift that God gave his people, a day of rest, a day of renewal, a day that reminded them that God was present with them. And the Sabbath originated as this gift that God gave his people after this incredible story in the Old Testament, the book of Exodus, where God's people were slaves and God freed them. The Sabbath was this reminder that their worth was in being, not just doing, not just working to death. So it's part of just the weekly rhythm. But Jesus, he oftentimes was going up against people that had made the Sabbath about regulations and rules and legalism, that had taken out of it just the intention and the goodness of it, and they'd made it something else. And so Jesus did things on the Sabbath, like he healed people, and he taught his followers to observe it in a way that was like honoring God, but not just about all of these dotting the I's and crossing the T's. So there's some controversy already when it comes to the Sabbath and Jesus. The next thing is, Jesus is at this dinner party, and he's being carefully watched. Now, I don't know about you, but when I go to a dinner party, I'm not looking forward to being carefully watched. That doesn't sound like a fun time, right? I mean, this is kind of like a tension-filled meal. So I think we can all relate to this because we probably had a meal like that before. Maybe you were having dinner with, a loved one or your spouse or someone, and maybe you had like a fight and you're having dinner. There's a little tension there. Or maybe you have to have a difficult conversation with someone and you do it over a meal. Or maybe it's a work situation. It's one of those lunches that isn't necessarily like a pleasant lunch, right? And you're sitting there and you're eating and you're trying to enjoy it, but you're like, do I make eye contact? Like, what am I really saying? And you're all just kind of like on pins and needles. Jesus is he's at this dinner party where he's being carefully watched, where there maybe is a little tension there. And all of this is happening at the house of a prominent Pharisee. Again, a person who has influence and power, a person who is important. So this is kind of like a fancy dinner party. Now, some commentators, what they said is happening in Luke 14 in the story is something in the ancient world that was called a symposium. And a symposium was a gathering of people who came together to debate things. So you'd have a meal together, and then you would have different thinkers, and you would debate different things. And you would just have kind of dinner and a show. For some of us, that sounds like a lot of fun. Others of us, maybe that sounds like a nightmare. You're like, no, I don't want to have a debate with my dinner. No, thank you. So Jesus is a part of this. And what happens next is Jesus begins to engage his host as well as the people who are at this party. Now, the first thing that Jesus does is he heals somebody. So again, this is the Sabbath. There's a man who's at the party who has a physical ailment. He has a swelling of his body, and Jesus heals him, and he basically kind of waits for people to respond, and no one says anything. Because again, there's already some controversy with that. But then Jesus goes on to tell a really short story, the first parable that he tells in Luke 14. And Jesus says something about humility and about how we view ourselves. So Jesus says, hey, when you go to a party, don't seek a place of honor for yourself. Instead, what you should do is humble yourself and take this seat that is maybe reserved for somebody who's of a different position than you. And then what will happen is your host will see that you sat in this one place, and he'll honor you by asking you to move up to this better seat. But if you do the opposite, if you seek this place of recognition, you're going to be embarrassed because then your host is going to ask you to move down. So Jesus is at this party. He's watching people kind of jockeying for position, trying to get those best seats right next to the host, front and center. And he says something about humility and how we view ourselves and really what that looks like. Then the next thing that Jesus does is he turns to his host and he says something about the people that are showing up at this party. Now, this is really interesting because this host has invited his friends and his neighbors and his family. And Jesus says to his host, hey, you should have invited people that could have never paid you back, because you've invited the people, and what they're going to do is they're going to invite you to the next party that they have. So next Friday night, right, you're going to get an invite to their house because you invited them, and it's just part of this whole social circle. What you should have done, Jesus says, is invite people that would have never gotten an invitation. Then you're going to be really blessed by God. Then you're going to really be paid back by God. Now, I think what's so interesting about what Jesus says here is that Jesus was criticized because of the people that he welcomed and included at his table, and how Jesus here is criticizing his host because his host only eats with people who are like him. So Jesus says all these things. These aren't necessarily pleasant things that Jesus has said so far at this dinner party. I don't know how excited the other guests are that Jesus is critiquing what they're doing and who is invited to this party. But then what happens next is there's a response from somebody at this dinner party. And they respond to what Jesus has just said, and that prompts the story that Jesus is going to share. So in verse 15, we have this response from one of the guests. It says, when one of those at the tables heard this, he said to Jesus, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." Now again, Jesus just said some comments about humility. He said some comments about who has been invited and shown up to this party. And then somebody responds by saying, what really matters are those who get an invite to the feast in the kingdom of God. Now, this unnamed character in the story, he's referencing a belief in Judaism about how God makes the world right at the end of time. And when we look into the Old Testament, there is this vision, there is this image that's described of how God brings about renewal and restoration to his people, and it's framed as a feast. It's framed as this great banquet that happens. And we find this in various places in the Old Testament, but one of the places where it's described and it was well known is in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is a prophet, and Isaiah describes this great banquet at the end of time in Isaiah 25. And this is how Isaiah describes this scene. He says this, "On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich foods for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats, and the finest of wines." That sounds like a good party, right? He goes on this mountain, he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove his people's disgrace from all the earth. The Lord has spoken. So Isaiah, again, he describes in this really beautiful language this great gathering. And this gathering was sometimes called the heavenly banquet or the messianic banquet. And again, it's this vision of how God is going to set things right when he brings his people together and he restores them and they celebrate. Now, Isaiah, he writes this scene during a difficult time in Israel's history. This was right after the northern kingdom had been exiled and the southern kingdom was going that way. And so Isaiah talks about a future hope, what God is up to, what God is doing. Don't forget that God is going to bring about this redemption, this restoration. And what he does is he swallows up death forever. He wipes away tears from all faces. This is imagery that we find in the very last book of the Bible in Revelation as well. This idea of God's renewal. But the debate that began to happen during the time of Jesus is who really gets an invite to this great banquet. Isaiah talks about all peoples being invited, but does God really mean all people? Surely that can't be true. He must mean some people. He must mean righteous people. He must mean people that have it all together. So at this dinner party, this guest who hears Jesus talk about humility, who hears him talk about who's invited, who knows that Jesus shares a table with other people that wouldn't be considered the insiders or the people that have life together, he says, what really matters, Jesus, is who gets an invite to this great banquet. And undoubtedly, this man, as well as the other people who were at this party, thought, well, Isaiah's talking about us. We're the ones who had the invite. We're the ones who are going to celebrate with God because of who we are. Now, Jesus doesn't say anything to this guy. He doesn't say, you're wrong, or he doesn't say, well, that's one way to read it. Instead, what he does is he launches into a story that is shocking and a story that's going to challenge a lot of the presuppositions that people at that table had. This is what happens next. Jesus replied, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet, and he invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, 'I have just bought a field and I must go and see it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I have just bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me.' And still another said, 'I just got married, so I can't come.'" So Jesus tells the story of a man, and he's throwing this big party. And kind of what would have been a common tradition is he sends out his servant to go and collect the RSVPs. People have been invited. Now the servant goes out and says, "Hey, the party's starting. You got to show up. It's happening right now. You don't want to miss it." But there are people that begin to make excuses why they can't come. And what's interesting is that all of these excuses, really, they highlight wrong priorities. And that's actually a big theme in Jesus' teachings. He talks about misaligned priorities and what it means to really be a follower of his, a disciple, a student of his, or to be a part of his work. You have to have the right priorities. So all these excuses really are misaligned priorities. And the first person says, "Hey, I just bought a field. I got some property. I need to go see it." Another one says, "Hey, I just got some new oxen. I want to go try them out." Third says, "Hey, I just got married. I can't make it. I got another party to go to." Now, what's interesting about all these excuses is they're not really valid excuses. It wasn't a practice to buy a field unseen. So the person probably already had seen the field. You didn't buy oxen unless you had already seen that they were like working and in good shape. And even going to a wedding, even having a wedding wasn't an excuse because you probably already had that party planned, and it's not necessarily a valid excuse to not come to this one. So this happens, but this isn't necessarily the shocking part of the story. Yeah, people can't come to the party. Okay, well, what's the host going to do? And one of the things that we talked about in parables is that oftentimes parables have what's called end stress because the emphasis on the parable happens at the end. That's where Jesus is really kind of bringing his closing point home. And what's shocking about this story is even though all these people that were invited can't make it, the party still goes on. See, if we threw a party and we planned a great party and we invited family and friends and it's going to be a great thing, and we started getting back a lot of no's, like a lot of people couldn't make it, we'd probably consider changing the date of our party, right? And be like, well, I'm not going to throw a party and have no one that I wanted to be there show up. Then I'm going to be stuck with maybe like that one family member that I kind of like, but I mean, it's just me and that other cousin. It's not going to be a great time. Or just me and that one neighbor. Like, I want to find a time when everyone can be there. But what's shocking is the party still goes on even though the guest list changes. Jesus continues in the story. He says, "A servant came back and he reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and he ordered his servant, 'Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.' 'Sir,' the servant said, 'what you ordered has been done, but there's still room. The party hasn't been filled up yet.' Then the master told his servant, 'Go out to the roads and country lanes and compel them to come in so that my house will be full. I tell you, not one of those who were invited will get a taste of my banquet.'" Now, Jesus is speaking a word here of truth, and it's kind of harsh. And he's speaking to this group of people who thought, of course they're a part of this great banquet. Why wouldn't they be? They have earned their place. So Jesus is critiquing that mindset. He's expanding their view and their understanding of God and his kingdom. But he's also inviting us just to think really about the nature of what God's kingdom is like. See, this man had said, "Jesus, what really matters is what the future holds, the future kingdom. That is what matters, where you get a seat in God's great feast." And Jesus was saying that God's kingdom isn't just the future. God's kingdom is present now. It's with me. It's here. And it looks like this great banquet where all people are invited to come in and experience God's forgiveness and his love and his healing. This man was fixated on a future event, and Jesus was saying the kingdom, it's here. And it looks like what I'm doing, inviting, including, and sharing God's love. See, the story is that there's a man that throws this party, and God is throwing a big party where all are invited to come in and experience and to celebrate that party. Jesus was challenging a lot of these understandings of what that meant to be included and what that meant to have a place in this party. Several years ago, I was on a global trip in the country of Ecuador. I've been to Ecuador several times. It's an incredible country. The people are absolutely amazing, so loving and hospitable. And I was on this trip one time, and we were doing some construction on a church that we partnered with there, and we were pouring some cement, concrete, and just kind of helping build this extension on the church. And we had this amazing day, and it was just a lot of fun. And then we found out that one of our team members, it was her birthday. And so we decided we had to throw a party. I told our host, Giovanni, he said, hey, let's go out, let's throw a party. So we went to the store, and we bought candy, and we bought, decorations, and a cake, and food. And we invited everyone in the church to come and be part of this party, and we invited the neighborhood. And then there was one final item that we needed to have just to make this a really good party. And it was a piñata. So we went out, and we got a piñata. And we came back to the church, and I started looking for a place that we were going to put this piñata, and I was looking for a rope and going to hang it somewhere. I was looking for a bat or a stick, and they said, no, we're going to do it a little differently. So what they had the birthday girl do, her name was Sarah, is they had her stand on this chair and just hold the piñata. And I noticed as she's standing on this chair holding the piñata, that there's like this big crowd that's gathering around her. And there's like kids, and there's students, and there's adults, and I'm kind of like backing up to the back a little bit. And so they count her down, and she rips open this piñata. Candy flies everywhere. And then what happens next is the most massive dog pile I've ever seen. Everyone just jumps in. I get pushed from the back, so I'm just like flying in the air. Everyone's grabbing candy. They're laughing. It's just this incredible scene. And I remember asking our host about it. I'm like, why did you do it that way? Like, what was the point? And he turned to me, and I love what he said. He said, it's because the party isn't just for her. The party's for everyone. Everyone gets to participate. Everyone gets to celebrate. And I heard him say that, and immediately I thought of Jesus' kingdom message. Jesus talks about how God's kingdom is like a banquet, like it's a wedding, like it's a party where all are invited to come in and experience it. The party is for everyone. At the end of this story, I love this line that Jesus uses. The servant comes back to the master and he says, hey, I've invited people that weren't on the original guest list, but there's still room. There's still room in your banquet. And he tells them, he says, go out to the roads and country lanes and compel them to come in. Go out even further than you imagined, even further than you thought possible, and compel them to come in. Now, this word compel, we read that, we might think it means to force or to coerce, but that's not what Jesus is saying. Instead, he's saying, insist. Insist that people would come to this banquet. Insist that they would know that they're welcome. That whatever feelings of shame or shyness that might hinder, that might make them think that they're not welcome at this banquet, insist that they would know there's an open seat for them. That the host of the party, he planned the party for them, that they could come in and share. Jesus talks about God's kingdom over and over again, describing it as a party, describing it as a banquet, describing it as something that's so much bigger and grander and more beautiful than we could imagine. And what allows us to have an invite to this party, what invites us in to be a part of the kingdom, is this thing called grace. I mean, that really is the foundation of Jesus' kingdom message. It's about grace. It's about what God has done for us. This is the heart of the gospel, the good news about Jesus, is God's love for us and what he's done on our behalf. The word grace means undeserved kindness. It means favor. And it's best understood as a gift. Grace is a gift, not something that we earn. Paul writes in Ephesians 2 that it's by grace you have been saved through faith, not by works. It's not something that we earn or achieve. It's something that God has done for us. Grace is a gift. The moment you have to work for something, it ceases to be a gift. Then becomes a wage. Paul writes in Romans that the wages of sin is death. Sin working in us, our wage, what we earn from sin is death. But the gifts of God in Christ Jesus is life, is forgiveness. The party goes on. The party is started. The party includes us because of God's incredible gift of grace. Jesus was living and teaching in a culture that had created all sorts of roadblocks and barriers for people to come in and experience God's love. There are all sorts of ways to divide people. Well, you're not good enough. Clean, unclean, holy, unholy, righteous, sinner. people that would never have felt close to God. And Jesus' message again and again, reflecting God's heart, was that God has a heart for all people. And his message is one of grace. His kingdom is one of grace, where all are invited to come in and to celebrate and to experience this incredible gift of being in God's family. You know, we live in a city, in a culture, in a world that's very different than the one that Jesus lived in. And we all can understand the first century Israel, Palestine is very different than the world of 2021. And yet, there's all sorts of things that are similar. There's still division. There's still social hierarchies. There's still oftentimes people made to feel as if they're not good enough to come in and join. We still see all those kinds of divisions in our world. We don't live in a world that's founded on grace. In a lot of ways, we live in a world that's founded on your influence, on your power, on competition, on what it means to be better than someone else, what it means to earn something. And I get that struggle, because I'm kind of, honestly, a competitive person at heart. I'm 36 years old, and I have to remind myself sometimes, Stephen, a pickup basketball game is just a pickup basketball game. It really doesn't matter. Although, now that I'm 36 and I'm out of shape and out of my prime, the Lakers might actually want to draft me now, so I'm kind of excited about that. It's kind of what they're doing right now, so we'll see. Now, I'm not saying competition is always a bad thing. Not at all. But God's kingdom isn't built on competition. It's built on grace. It's not built on comparison or competing or how we earn something. Jesus sat at this table with people who thought, yeah, of course I'm in. Why wouldn't I be? I've done all these things, and Jesus consistently talks about the heart. Talks about where our heart is at, and talks about how God's kingdom isn't about that. It's about grace. It's about what God has done in Jesus. And praise God that that is how his kingdom works. That we don't earn our way in, but we accept what he's done on our behalf. And there's an open seat at the table because of Jesus. See, there's this image I think Jesus wants us to really understand as we read these words and we read this story. There's a reason Jesus tells us when he's at this dinner party. There's a reason why Jesus shared meals so often with people. He understood the power of that relational connection. Jesus understood that tables, what they can do is they can create societies in the same way that they can divide societies. And when Jesus let people come in, when he welcomed them, when he didn't make them earn their place, but said that God was for them and with them and that God loved them, he created an alternative reality that was so different than anything in their world. The church does the same thing. We are a community of grace. We gather because we realize we all need grace to receive that and to share that with each other as we pursue Jesus together. You know, sometimes we read the Bible, and one of the things that often happens is we'll read a passage, we'll read a story, and immediately we start thinking, okay, what's the application? I just read this. I really want to know what to do with it. And I think with the parables, this is oftentimes especially difficult. Like, how do I figure this out? How do I apply this? Sometimes Jesus, what I think he's doing is he's inviting us just to reimagine the world we live in, to see things from his perspective, to let our minds be challenged by the way that he is and the way he acts and how he reminds us of who God is and shows us truly what God is like. And in this story, I wonder if this image of a table might be something that we just think on, that we just process, that we just allow his teaching to kind of penetrate our hearts and to sit there for a moment. And maybe the first thing that we can do is simply to think of what God's table is like, what God's kingdom is like, what his family is like. That perhaps God's table is infinitely bigger than any of us could have ever imagined. That God's grace is so good, that his love is so powerful, that he invites us in, that he sends his son so that we might know that. And maybe we feel at times like we have excuses, kind of like in the story. We think, well, hey, I just have a lot of things in my life that are priorities. I just don't feel like I can be a part of that party. Or maybe one of the excuses that we make in our lives is we just simply feel, not me, God. Other people, sure, but not me. You couldn't possibly have a seat for me. You know, there's this phrase that I've heard people tell me before in my life that absolutely breaks my heart. I've heard people say to me, you know, I just feel like I'm a lost cause to God. Just a lost cause. The truth is, in our lives, yeah, there may be times when we're lost. I know there's been times in my life when I've been lost. But but you are never a lost cause to God. You're his kid, and he loves you. You're his son. You're his daughter. And he has an invitation for you to come and be a part of his great banquet. And maybe for some of us, we just need to hear that truth, that God is for you. That you are not disqualified from his family, but you're invited in. I love what Paul says in Romans 5, this short verse, one of my favorite verses. He says, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God demonstrates, or he proves his love. Before we even knew it, before we even recognized it, he sent his son. He initiated it. See, the gospel is a message of our identity in Christ. It's not something that we achieve. It's something that we receive because of what Jesus has done for us. So maybe as we think about God's table, that is just an invite for us to consider him calling us and how he calls others as well. But perhaps another image that we can think of is our own table. Your table, my table, our collective table as a church. Maybe we kind of feel like the Pharisee in the story who had this great party, but everyone that he invited, everyone that he included, everyone that was sitting down at his table looked like him, thought like him, acted like him. Jesus sat at tables that were very exclusive, right? He sat at tables where he was welcome because of who he was, other people weren't. But the table that Jesus consistently created in his life was inclusive. It was people who were thought to be far from God. It was a message of God's grace and his goodness and love that was beyond comprehension. So maybe the invitation as we follow Jesus is to think the people that we have relationships with in our lives, think about that and what it looks like to have more connection, more conversations, and even more meals where we invite people to share in our lives and to have a seat at the table. God is throwing this incredible party, and we're invited to come in and celebrate and to share in that. There's this guy named Klein Snodgrass, which is definitely the best last name I've ever heard. Snodgrass. It's just fantastic. And he wrote a book called Stories with Intent, which is all about the parables. And I love how he describes Luke 14. And I want to end here with his description. He says this: Jesus eating with toll collectors and sinners is a demonstration of the presence of the kingdom in his ministry and the forgiveness available to those who respond. The message Jesus is sharing is forgiveness is real, it's possible, it's here. Come and have a seat at the table. And he goes on and says, the point of these texts and the parable of the banquet can be summarized with a statement and a question. God is giving a party. Are you going to come? We have a God who throws a party. In fact, what we do as a church every week when we gather on Sunday, we gather to celebrate this God who shows us grace and love. We gather to celebrate how God is working in our lives throughout the week, and we come to this place to throw open the doors and say, there's another seat. There's a seat at the banquet for you, for you. We come to be people who celebrate and share in kingdom life. Do our lives point to how big and awesome and good God is? Have we experienced that grace, and are we wanting to be those people that share that grace with others? Because God is giving a party. And the question is, are you going to join in? And are we going to help others join in as well?